Welcome everyone to tonight's class, Sketching and Painting a Purple Passion Flower. I'm your instructor, Adrienne Hodge, and tonight's class is part one of a two-part class where we will be creating this lovely little mixed media painting of a purple passion flower. So we'll be working on the sketching and painting part tonight, or the sketching part, and then we're going to get started on the painting process and maybe get one or two layers of watercolor onto that tonight. That's the goal. And then in next week's class in part two, we'll be adding more layers of watercolor and then even some gouache and some pen and ink and some fun details with mixed media. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and switch to my tabletop view and go over supplies. Don't forget to tag your work with the hashtags Make It With Michaels or Michaels Classes, and you can follow me on Instagram at Adrienne Hodge. I recently changed my Instagram handle from Adrienne Hodge Art to my nickname, Adrienne Hodge here, just to make it a little less of a mouthful. I'm also on Facebook at Adrienne Hodge Fine Art, and there's some of my business cards I'm always flashing on screen. You want to check out some of my personal work on Instagram or anywhere else online. Okay, and here is the piece that we'll be working towards by the end of class next week. And in tonight's class, we're going to be doing some sketching, breaking down the purple passion flower into its parts and also looking at the whole, zooming in, zooming out, looking at some details, talking about the contour lines, all those fun things. Okay, so I am using Artist Loft supplies from Michaels. I've got this Artist Loft drawing pad here, and I have some Artist Loft pencils and an Artist Loft eraser. And let's see, then when we move on to the little painting portion tonight, got the watercolor paper, my Artist Loft watercolor paper pad, and Artist Loft watercolor paintbrushes. And then I've got a couple of water cups nearby and some paper towels. And then I have this lovely little watercolor set by Artist Loft that comes with a fun little case and little transparency that tells you all the colors that are in the set. So that's what we'll be getting started with tonight. And the next week, we're going to be using some Artist Loft gouache and pen and ink, but in tonight's class, we will likely only get to the first layers of the watercolor. So if you have everything else on that list handy, that's good to have it all nearby. And you'll be ready for next week as well. And I think that's it. Okay, and then we have the reference photo that I provided, a PDF of the reference photo of this purple passion flower. So that's what we'll be working from. And if you are watching later on YouTube, all you have to do is search, just click on the three little dots at the bottom where it says see more under the video, and it will give you the supply list and it will show you the link to the PDF with that reference photo. Okay, so we have had several other classes on drawing flowers, well, and other painting flowers classes as well. But we have done this particular method that I'm using tonight of breaking down flowers to all of these fundamental parts, and I've called this series Flower Fundamentals in the past. So our lovely moderator has a few links, there are several links to share with you that will take you to those other YouTube classes that we've had in the past on different flowers. So there was the Datura flower, an orchid, a rose, hydrangeas, and I think that was it. And then there was also one on leaves, fall leaves. So if the leaves are giving you trouble in this this drawing, because we're not going to focus too much on the leaves. We're going to be really loose with those leaves. But if you wanted that, we have had a class on drawing leaves before. Okay, and in all of those classes, I have really zoomed in on the parts of the flowers and zoomed in and zoomed out and have looked at the contour lines. So the contour lines are the elevational lines that are found on any three-dimensional form, basically just lines that we can draw that describe the latitude and longitude of the elevation that you're seeing across that three-dimensional form. So we're going to use that to break down all of these flowers and kind of zoom out and also look at what the basic shapes that we're seeing as well. So we'll start very general and then we'll get more specific. So any questions about supplies or anything like that before I get started?
No supply questions so far. Just one about whether or not you've done a sunflower class yet.
Oh, yes, we did have a sunflower class last year with gouache. I didn't put that one in there, but
I'll see if I can
yeah.
find it.
Yeah, we sketched the sunflower before. It didn't break it down and do this whole thing with it, but we definitely sketched it loosely. I'm sure I talked about the contours at least a little bit on it because it's very unlike me to say how to draw something without talking about those contour lines. So, okay, so we're going to spend about an hour, maybe just under this first hour on the drawing aspect of this flower, and then we'll get it sketched out on the watercolor paper. So if your drawing skills are really amazing and you're just here because you like to follow along and do fun classes and you want to go ahead and start sketching it on, excuse me, on the watercolor paper. Oh, I could tell there was going to be another one, but decided not to pause. Anyway, so yeah, if you want to go ahead and sketch this on the watercolor paper, like once we start really, getting in there with it, that's fine because we are going to sketch it again. So if that gives you some anxiety that I'm going to, do all this on the sketchbook paper, and then I'm going to quickly sketch it on the watercolor paper. And if you just don't like to draw things twice, but you trust your drawing abilities, just know that we're going to be drawing it a second time. We're going to draw it several times, but then we're going to draw it again really quickly. It's just an under sketch for the mixed media painting. Okay, and then we'll add a few layers of watercolor, see how much time we have to do all of that. So let me just get a fresh sheet of paper here. And the reference image. I'm going to try to have my reference image semi in view here while I'm drawing, but you're going to want to have it handy. It's sometimes challenging to get both the reference image and my drawing to fill up the screen at the same time. Also, you use whatever pencil you feel most comfortable with. I do recommend that you start sketching with a very light pencil, an H pencil, a pencil that has the letter H on it. And that way you can draw nice and light lines that are easy to erase. But I am going to be sketching with a darker pencil, like a 4B here. And I might even switch to something even darker if I have issues, because when I sketch with graphite on Zoom, it just does not show up very well on the Zoom. And I can do my best to try to get it darker, but I'm going to start out kind of light as I find shape. So just don't freak out on me, y'all. If you can't see my drawing right away, it will come into view as I start to draw a little darker, and emphasize things. So it's just the nature of Zoom. Okay. Yeah, like I said, if you can't see it at first, I'll go over it again, but I'm not a robot. I have to start out sketching lightly until I find the shapes I'm looking for. But inevitably someone says, hey, I can't see your drawing when I'm doing that. Someone saying the page is very bright and hard to see. I don't want to zoom out too far because then you're not going to be able to see my drawing as well. I'm going to keep it like that and see if we have continual issues. All right, so the first thing I want to do is be very general with this purple passion flower because there is a lot going on this flower. It is such a weird alien flower, as many flowers are. The more we look at them, there's so many layers to it. There's so many parts, and there are these petals underneath, and then we have these like little stringy coil things that are really fun, almost like little curly hue hairs sticking out, or noodles. I'll probably call them noodles a lot. And then we have at the end of those noodles, we've got these things that look very Beetlejuice-esque, very Tim Burton-esque little almost black and white stripes. They're like a deep purple color there. And like a little checker pattern, and they're almost like little hairs underneath there. And then on top of that, we've got what's going on here at the center of the flower, which feels like a pinwheel. The whole thing feels like a pinwheel, but we've got these flat, almost rectangular prism shapes coming out with little, what feels like tape at the end of them, little petals taped on the end of them. It's very interesting. And then we've got these little nodes coming off, which feel like bones. They feel like femur bones a little bit. So that's all sticking out. It's like a pinwheel on top of a pinwheel on top of a pinwheel. So we've got 3 or 4 different layers of pinwheels happening here. And we're just going to start with that. We're going to start with a very general drawing of like, if we were to draw this as a 2-dimensional flower, and I'm going to draw it nice and big. Okay, so the first thing, we're going to go from the bottom up. Actually, let's start with a big circle. So we'll start with a big circle. Let's see if sometimes having the iPad on the screen can also mess with my light there. Okay, so we're going to start with a big circle. Nope, that's too much light. Okay. And then we've got the petals underneath that. And like I said, I'm starting out light because I'm just finding the shape I'm looking for. If I go too dark, then I can't erase. But I will darken this up once I find the general shape I'm looking for. So very kindergarten, elementary school level drawing, like maybe what a paper plate would look like with a bunch of construction paper ribbons coming off of it. But that's what we're starting with. It's just, we're making it 2D for a second. We're making it flat and 2-dimensional. We're not thinking about the 3-dimensional shapes just yet. We're thinking about the 2-dimensional shapes that are making up all of these 3-dimensional shapes. Okay, so we've got that very general shape to start with. But then our circle in the center is not a perfect circle. It's more like this, if we think about what the Tim Burton checker pattern situation is doing. So overall, it is creating this little aura around the center circle. And ideally, you didn't draw any of this too dark so that you can erase any through lines and start to stack things as they are overlapping each other, because that center of the flower overlaps most of those petals underneath. All right, and then the next layer is the noodles. That's their official name. Okay, and we're not technically making them all three-dimensional, but we do want to think about how they have two sides to them. It's not just one, it's not just one line. We need a double line for all of these. If we want, any kind of realism to happen, if we want this to resemble the actual flower, and we're not going to draw each and every one of them because that would be so tedious, but try to bounce around and sketch a bunch of them. Just start thinking about the idea that they are double-sided. Some of them are kind of bunched together. And then if you get a little lazy, you can start to just do some little curly Q squiggles. And we'll have kind of a combination of just one line curly Q squiggles and those double-sided lines that sort of curl at the end, and they do some really fun twisty curly things at the end. So maybe do a little curly Q and then make it double-sided. All right, you get the idea. So like I said, we're going to end up drawing all of these parts a few times. And this is just the two-dimensional one. But we need to get a sense of the whole before we try to break it down to the parts. All right, so we've got that layer of noodles, right? And then if we go in a little more on the center, there's that hair-like center before it goes into the things that feel like beaded curtains. It just occurred to me they could also be like beaded curtains. And then we've got, you could recognize how those are all little hair-like structures that make that up. Okay, and then just keeping it 2D. We're not going to worry about the 3D aspect here because we're going to zoom in on the 2D aspect. So let's just think about another circle in the middle. We don't want to get our brains too overloaded. Okay, and then just start to notice, how there's 3 of these things that feel a little thicker and maybe more bone-like sticking out. They kind of make like a, also, it doesn't have to be perfect. I just realized I didn't draw those shapes exactly in the way they're showing up. But there's 3 of them. Okay, and then we've got the little rectangular pieces sticking out that then have another little curly rectangular piece. Really feels like a piece of tape is stuck to them. Little petal tape ribbons. Okay, so something like that. So that's our making it flat and 2D version of the purple passion flower. All right, so now let's zoom in and look at the 3-dimensional aspects of all of these parts as a whole. All right, so I'm not going to draw each and every part of this flower in detail. I wish I could zoom in on my drawing for you. Here, let me hold it up a little closer. So I'm going to draw it as big as I can on this piece of paper. So we're going to look at some of the contours of some of these petals. So if you can see, I drew elevational lines on these petals. I will draw them darker when I do this again. But it's honestly not going to maybe look as nice when I draw it all this dark, but I'm going to do my best because there's lots of layers here, right? And it's ideal if you draw them at the value that you're seeing them, which the petals underneath are much lighter than the center of the flower. So anyway, then we're going to look at the center of the flower and the contours on some of these things like the bone-like shapes and the little rectangular parts that are sticking out, the tape and how those curl in 3 dimensions. And then we'll really zoom in here on one of these just particular moments at the center and notice some of the texture that we're seeing here and how we can use the value and soften with our pencils to get some of that to come across. Okay, and then we'll also really zoom in on some of this aspect, the little beaded curtains and noodles, and see how they interplay and interact with each other so that we can get some details on those. So I'm not advising that you, I mean, if you want to go for hyper realism, you could do this nice and big and put all this detail in your mixed media painting. But when we go to paint this, I want to keep it nice and loose and kind of whimsical. So really just having an understanding of all of these parts and zooming in like this are going to enable you to draw them, hopefully, nice and loose and still help them feel three-dimensional and separate yet connected and all that good stuff. Okay. Well, let's zoom in now. And just, we're gonna focus on the contours of like one aspect of each of these layers. So we'll look at a couple of the petals. We'll look at a couple of the, this part at the center. And if anybody knows the parts of the flower and wants to correct me so I stop calling them noodles and beaded curtains, I'd be totally fine with that. Just interrupt me if you know the names of the parts of this flower. That would be good to know. But I'm going to just keep calling them like I see it. Okay, so let's look at one of these petals. And yeah, like we said, it'll get easier to see as I progress here. Okay, so just looking at one of the petals, I'm looking at this one right here. We're looking for the organic shape of that petal, like a little paddle or an oar. And it has a mostly vertical, like vertical straight lines, I would say, for most of it. But then it starts to curve, it feels a little flat in a lot of places on the vertical axis. But then as we get to the end here, there starts to be a curve starting to happen. So I would get some curved lines to happen here at the end. And yeah, like I said, having my iPad right there sometimes makes the light go screwy. So I'm just going to keep it away. I used to always work with handouts, like printouts, but then I couldn't zoom in, and I like being able to zoom in on the photo. So anyway, so we're looking for some curved lines there. And then when we do the horizontal axis contour lines, then we're really going to be able to illustrate how there's a curved axis happening here. So all that just makes it feel more three-dimensional and more curved. And as you're adding your watercolor paint or any pen and ink value, if you just, put a little bit of a curve to your brush strokes and your mark making, then it will feel more three-dimensional there. But whenever we paint if we're painting it pretty loose, like I did here, it's really just as you're adding your brush strokes, just understanding that those are slightly curved at the end so that they feel curved as we pull this painting together. So, and then some of the petals, let's do one more. Curve in the slightly different direction, like looking at, well, this one definitely kind of curves down, but it's a little hard to see. Let's look at this one, how it has this little crinkle in it. So I'm just going to sketch some of these other ones in here really loosely. And some of them stick out a little farther than others. So there's this one that does this little crinkle thing. So as we're watching how the contours would shift on that crinkle, they're gonna flow in the same direction as the wrinkle or the crinkle does. Okay, so we've got vertical lines that do that, a little bit like a staircase. And then the horizontals are gonna follow either a curved path or straight path, depending on where they are on that petal. So just noticing that stuff and having that slight curve to your brush strokes or some of your hatching, cross hatching marks that you might add with the pen and ink will just add to the 3 dimensions there. And please let me know if I'm using any terms that you are not familiar with, because chances are we've had a class in the past that covers those concepts. And I could tell you the name of the class that you could reference if you'd like, or topics that you can look up. Oh, I see. Wrigley Whitmer said the stamens are the bone-like structures. All right, nice. I'll use that term when I get there. Stamens or stamens, am I saying that right? Now I have to worry if I'm pronouncing it correctly.
It's stamens. I was gonna wait till you got to the stamens and
Okay, cool, thank you.
uh-huh.
All right, so just going layer by layer here. Let's zoom in a little bit on, we don't know what these are called, the noodle things.
No clue.
Okay. The little beaded curtains. So I'm just kind of putting that little aura in there. It feels like rays of the sun to just like get the sketch in like we did in the 2-dimensional version of the sketch. And that'll just help us see the whole a little bit and get the parameters going. And this is just a preliminary sketch, so I'm not too worried about, if as a whole these petals are exactly the way I want them to look. Like I know some of the petals are actually sticking out a little differently, but that's okay. It's an organic thing. So I always like to say when I'm drawing organic things, it doesn't have to look like that particular passion flower. We just want it to look like a passion flower. So if it's not identical to the passion flower in the photograph, but it still looks like one, then we're good. Okay, so the shapes that I think really help to make these feel 3-dimensional is to do some little circles. So, or you could do little rectangles, but since they are rounded on the ends of the noodles are rounded. I think if we did rectangles, they might start to feel a little too flat, but doing these like kind of elongated circles like this, I think can start to, and to stagger them and think about bricks and how bricks stagger, right? So if we stagger them, then they overlap and they start to feel like the ends of those noodles that look like beaded curtains. And you can bounce around if you're the type of person that gets really antsy when you're drawing the same thing over and over again. Drawing a flower like this is probably not your jam. It's very repetitive. There's a lot of repetition in this thing.
So Adrienne, apparently the noodles are called corona filament. That's what Karen has shared with us.
Whoa. All right. Let me write this down. We got the corona filament. I love it. And then stamens were the bone-like structure. All right, y'all let me know if you know any other terms. See, this just makes the class more interactive. If I had looked up those terms before, then wouldn't be as fun, right? Okay, so you get the idea. you can almost like space out a little bit and just start to draw them. It reminds me so much of something you would find at the bottom of the ocean, like coral. All right, so you can fill in as many of those as you want, but that'll definitely start to make it feel three-dimensional. Just having those all staggered, and you could start to fill some of them in with black and notice how or just with the darker value of your pencil. Also, I realize I'm talking about value, but just want to do a quick little value scale here. So I'm always thinking in terms of a scale from 0 to 10. So 10 being our absolute black, no paper showing through. And then we can pull up on the pressure on our pencil to get lighter values to happen. So even with this, what do I have? A 4B. Can get half of my value scale to happen. And then I can switch to a 2B or a B pencil and blend that out a little bit and start to go into my lighter value. And then when I'm talking about where the light is hitting directly, I'll say a 0. So that's where we're talking about blank paper. So the 0 to 10, that's our blank paper. Or next week when we use our white gouache, we'll use our white gouache for the 0. And then, and I think I put a white gel pen on the supply list as well for some of those details if you didn't have the gouache. And then the 10 is the absolute dark or black. And it is really more of like a dark purple there in the center, but we can use some black as well to really push those 10 values. Okay, and then we've got some overlapping and we've got the three-dimensional form of the center. So the bone-like structures are called the stamens. I wonder what I want to talk about this. We made it a circle when we made it two-dimensional, but it's really more of like a gumdrop here in the center. So I'm going to draw a gumdrop shape at the bottom of my page just so I can.
So that's actually the reproductive organ for the flower, apparently.
Okay.
It's the ovaries and the ovule.
Oh, cool. All right.
And the stigma says Wrigley.
Oh, I see it. And did I misspell ovaries or did Wrigley misspell ovaries?
From this science journal picture I just found, it looks like you spelled it correctly.
Okay.
And
All right.
then stigma or stigma, I can't figure out which one is correct. So.
All right, cool. So we've got a gumdrop shape to this. So if we draw this little rounded triangle to start with, and then think about how on the horizontal axis, it's curved like this. And then on the vertical axis, it's curved like this. So it sort of radiates down like a bowl. But then we don't have just a perfect gumdrop shape because it's got these little indentions in it like this. So, but overall, we're looking for something like this, bit of like a candy corn, or feels like a tooth, maybe, or a gumdrop. So that's the three-dimensional shape that we're looking for here in the center. Some of my paintbrushes are rolling down my desk. All right, so that's what we're looking for in the center. And it's overlapped by our stamens. So We're going to draw it nice and light and just draw the parts of it that are visible. So just keep in mind how it's being overlapped. And let's go ahead and draw those stamens since they are overlapping. So we're really looking for that. We're going to zoom in on these in a second, so I don't want to. Let me see how we're doing on time. All right, 20 more minutes here to do those other sketches. I think we can do it because we're breaking it down so well here already. So this is why you want to be drawing light the whole time so that you can easily erase when you've got this overlapping happening. Okay, so I'm just going to sketch them in real quick, these bone shapes of the stamens. And then I'll draw the contours really quick. And if it's hard to see, never fear. I'm going to zoom in and draw it bigger and do that again. Okay, so like I said, if you're impatient with yourself, you could go ahead and be sketching this onto the watercolor paper right now, and then just not adding these contour lines. If you know yourself and you know that you're not going to want to sketch it again really quickly, or that that's going to bother you in some way, because I'm going to go fast when I sketch it again on my watercolor paper, just FYI. Okay, so on the horizontal axis, we've got curved lines here, and I can draw this a little bigger on another page in just a second. So if it's hard to see what I'm doing, and it separates on this side and splits off into two pieces at the end there. And then on the vertical axis, it's just following that same path. Like if it radiates out, splits up, do the same thing. All right, so we're just looking for an understanding of the 3 dimensions. You don't even necessarily have to draw these contours, but I find that drawing these contour lines really helps me just wrap my brain around the 3 dimensions that I'm looking at there. And it also helps later when I'm painting the muscle memory of understanding and drawing these contour lines. It creates this muscle memory in your hand so that when you go to paint it and loosely fill in with paint, hopefully you're having an understanding of 3 dimensions there. But we're also going to keep it really loose when we paint it, and it's going to be kind of small. So don't worry too much about it. It really just helps with the value as well. And if you wanted to develop your drawing more, then definitely paying attention to the value and making the value follow these 3-dimensional curves is important. Okay, and then the last part here, even though it's underneath, I think it's a little easier to draw them underneath since they're with the overlapping that's happening here. So we've got the rectangle, and then we've got this little, what feels like a ribbony piece of tape. And I am going to draw this down here again in the margins, just so I can draw it nice and big. So the ribbon part of the tape is what really curls around and has some overlapping. So let's say this is the little rectangle part sticking out. The ribbon piece of tape part here, it does that action. So the contours are, they're following that overlap, that little curl over. So keep in mind just the directional curve of the elevation there, and that's going to help that not feel flat, to have an understanding of those curved lines. But again, when we go to sketch it nice and loose, it's not a big deal. If it's, it's going to be real loose and sketchy. It doesn't have to have all this detail. Just breaking it all down and zooming in and helping us have a better understanding of the flower. But we don't really necessarily need all of this knowledge, but it definitely helps. Okay, so we've got the little ribbons. to the, I guess these are the stemma, I'm assuming, and then the center part was the ovaries. There's 5 of those sticking out. All right, I'll get the idea. I'm not going to draw all of them. Okay, let's move on to zooming in on, let's see. Yeah, we'll try to zoom in on both of those next parts. These other sketches that I have here. So let's go ahead and zoom in on the, oh my gosh, I already forgot the name. The corona filaments. Let's zoom in on the corona filaments. Okay. So let's see, which part will we zoom in on? I mean, it doesn't have to look exactly like wherever we're zooming in. Let's zoom in over here, right here, this area. Okay. Because I'm left-handed and I want to be drawing in, in a direction towards the right. So I'm not going over my, even though those are kind of overlapped over there in that corner by the stemma. I'm still gonna zoom in over here in this little area. Okay, so we're gonna start out with those two-sided shapes. But this time we're gonna go a little slowly and we're just gonna draw maybe, 7 or 8 of them together here. But again, they do not have to be exactly like they look in the photo, but you definitely want them to feel organic. So notice how there might be 1 or 2 moments, like one in particular that sticks out at you. Try to draw at least 1 or 2 in a way that looks pretty close to how you're seeing it. That's just going to help the drawing overall feel a little more realistic and organic if we can just have 1 or 2 areas where we're really noticing the detail. I teach a lot of private lessons, and in a private lesson session recently, we were doing a very tedious drawing of some mushrooms, and they were very repetitive like this. And I said, think about a map, like north, south, east, and west, right? And find an interesting corona filament in the north and an interesting corona filament in the east and the south and the west, and put a little bit of detail on just 1 or 2 over here, 1 or 2 here, 1 or 2 over here, and then let the rest be really loosey-goosey. That's what we're going to do when we paint it, is we're going to just make 1 or 2 of them stick out realistically. Or, in any one area, we're more than 1 or 2, maybe 4 or 5, but we're not going to do it all over. It's just one bit of advice overall for your drawing practice is think about the fact that you are always creating an optical illusion on the page, or that's what you're attempting to do. And the human eye wants to see what is familiar to them. And neuroscience tells us we can only focus on one thing at a time. That's why optical illusions work on us, and drawing is an optical illusion. We're creating an optical illusion on the page. So you just want to trick your viewer into seeing a purple passion flower. And you do that by suggesting these parts that the viewer will complete the picture as a whole. You can leave it unfinished in a lot of areas and they will still see what you're trying to make them see. So as long as we have an understanding, a deep understanding of some of these parts, we can keep it loose. in the final execution of it here. All right, so then we're gonna put those little staggered shapes. And I'm just putting them on there like little rounded seed shapes like I did before. I'm trying to stagger them. If we zoom in, we just want to make our value follow that three-dimensional curve. So I'm curving my value, wrapping it around that, making little, like my contour lines that I drew before. I'm making my pencil follow that curve. So I'm not just filling it in flat, I'm filling it in according to those 3 dimensions, and that's going to make it feel more three-dimensional. And if you wanted to keep adding value with your pencil and just softening your value to get it to blend out, this is the darkest part of the flower. So this is where if you were just going to keep sketching it in pencil, you would really want to get some deep value going. Okay, let's zoom in on the stamens now. I had to look again, I totally forgot. All right, so we're zooming in on one of those stamens. We got the bone shape. Oh, geez. I have my phone in Do Not Disturb, but my daughter is texting me cute stuff. Okay, so there's a little bit of it that's visible. The underside of it that's visible there. So we're getting that, oops, that part in there as well. And then, so I'm looking at this particular one, and then I'm going to draw this, geez, y'all, keep forgetting the stemma coming out right next to it. And we're going to look at the texture on that as well. But yeah, please don't feel overwhelmed because we're about to sketch it so loosey-goosey and paint it so loosey-goosey. But zooming in like this is, I think, just essential to not getting overwhelmed with a flower like this. You know, knowing it inside and outside here. Okay, so let me get my iPad away so it's not messing with my light again. Every time I plan a graphite class, I'm like, all right, I'm doing this. It's so important to talk about the graphite, but it's such a struggle on Zoom. Okay, so let's just look at some of this value. You don't necessarily have to draw all the contours again, but just notice the value, because when we add the paint, this is where we want to add some of the darker paint to start to create the illusion of depth here. So noticing where the underbelly part is darker and this little node underneath is darker, and how there's that little split in the center. And I'm using the side of my pencil and I'm keeping it nice and soft. Okay, and then on the stemma, it's got these little stippling dots on it, which we can add with our pen and ink next week. Our Artist Loft illustration pens, and we'll get some of this texture to happen here. And then same thing as on the stemma. Or the stamens, with the stemma, we want to have that value curling where the ribbon curl over happens. So again, this will just help us with the paint to recognize where we need a little bit of darker paint, or maybe with the pens where we want to create some accents and some depth and some 3 dimensions here. And then if you wanted to sketch a little bit of the corona filament that you're seeing in between there, just to see how all of this would stack together, you're welcome to do that for some extra practice. All right, so that's all the zooming in and zooming out that I wanted to do on the purple passion flower. And now I'm going to grab my watercolor paper and I'm going to sketch it again. And I'm going to tape this off, get this all ready for our painting. Any questions about anything before I move on from the sketching part?
Not about the drawing. We do have someone who just wanted to confirm you are currently using the water paper or watercolor paper, correct?
Yeah, I'm moving on. I've now just pulled out my watercolor paper.
Oh, okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I've got that watercolor block, and then I'm going to take my tape and we're going to create a little frame here, but I'm not going to use a ruler. If you would like to use a ruler, you are welcome to, but I'm just going to do a bit of a trick with the tape that will make it so that I don't need a ruler. I am just going to eyeball it here. You could also trace something if you had like, well, I've got like, we've done before, we've traced like a tarot card or a business card to make a frame, but that would be a little small on this paper, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to just do my trick with the tape, but if you wanted to get a ruler or if you wanted to measure it out, feel free to do that. You may have to pull the tape off to get it perfect. I do this all the time. I'm just going to eyeball it and I'm going to go kind of 1.5 inches maybe out from the edge of the paper, from the vertical, and tape that. And I may adjust this. I may decide to make it a little bigger. We'll see. Do the same thing, and I'm just eyeballing it and just seeing, like, does that look about how wide I want my image to be? I'm gonna go a little bit farther out because I want to be able to make it a little bigger than I did before. So maybe just go in 1 inch in from the side of this paper. And if you're working on a loose sheet of watercolor paper, then you may want to tape all 4 edges down to the paper as well to keep it from buckling. I'm not doing that because I'm working on this block, so I shouldn't have to. It's going to stay pretty secure on this block of paper, but if you need to tape down all 4 sides, then you might do that as well. And if you're doing that, then you're just going to go kind of half on and half off the edge of the paper to get it to tape down to your table surface. And you're going to do that so that your paper doesn't buckle as we add water to it. Okay, and then I'm going to go about 2 inches down from the top, from the horizontal axis. And again, I'm just eyeballing it so that I can make a nice rectangle in the center here. And I do this all the time, and sometimes my eyeball measurements are a little off, and no one ever says anything about it. And people still pay me lots of money for my original art sometimes. Not all the time. I'm gonna make it a little bigger here at the top and the bottom. I'll move my tape one more time. So again, I'm just kind of looking back and forth with my eyes from the top to the bottom to see if I made it about the same length on the margin at the top and the bottom, and it looks about the same on both sides to me. So that looks pretty straight. You're welcome to grab a ruler if you want it to be more exact. Okay. Now we need to sketch our purple passion flower again, and this is the part I'm the most worried about y'all freaking out on me because I'm just going to sketch it again and you're not going to be able to see my lines because I want to draw it nice and light because I want to be able to erase my lines. So I'm going to use an H pencil and I'm going to draw using the side of the pencil, and I'm not going to put too much pressure down at all. And I'm going to keep all of my lines just sitting on the surface of the paper like a baby's breath. And I'm just basically going to draw this image to start, our like more two-dimensional thing, but I'm going to get a little more three-dimensional with a few details. You know, I'm going to look at the north, south, east, west, and get a few more details on some of those different flower parts. But I'm going to sketch it first real loose just to make sure that I've got the whole thing within this frame. So I might have to do it a couple of times, and you might have to do the same. You want to leave enough space for some of those leaves in the background, unless you want to just zoom way in and just focus on the center of the flower. That could be fun too, if you want to zoom in a little more, or if you want to even zoom out more than this. It is up to you. Okay, so I sketched some of these kind of flat, and now I'm just going back in and making them a little more organic, adding those interesting curves to some of them. But yeah, I want to keep it super light. I'm always so torn with something like this between wanting to go back in and sketch it a little darker so y'all can see it. But, you know, we just spent almost an hour drawing it together. So I'm not doing anything different other than leaving it more sketchy. Okay, so now I'm on that aura part. And this is why I was saying if this aspect of it is going to be stressful for you, you might have wanted to just be drawing on the watercolor paper all along. Right, so I got the little aura part, and then just for the sake of overlapping, I'm going to go ahead and jump to the ovaries and the stamens. And I'm noticing how they stick out pretty far, like almost overlapping onto the petals past the corona filament. And now I'm sketching the stemma. just the basic shape of them, but also keeping in mind where those three-dimensional little ribbon curves are happening. They're overlapping, curving over themselves. Just a real loose, basic, empty sketch with some elements of three-dimensional kind of visual notes to yourself. So that when you're painting it, you don't forget to add that curve or change the color of the value of the color that you're using. Okay. Always wait a second for that to come into focus after I move the iPad away. All right, and then now I'm drawing those little rounded pill shapes with the corona filament and staggering those around. And honestly, we don't need to draw all of these. These could all be added with the pen and ink next week. And you could always start with the pen first instead of adding the watercolor first, but I think I want to start with the watercolor first. And then we'll add the pen at the start of next week's class when everything's dry, and then keep layering on top of it. That's my plan. Okay, so I've got a few of those little staggered pill shapes, and then I'm going to start to just put some corona filament details in here. So like I said, just starting in every corner and putting a few in there that are highly detailed. And then honestly, I'm not going to draw too much of the rest of them, because if I do too much pencil here, it's going to just be something I have to erase later. So I just want to keep in mind that this is going to be, you know, sort of left light with our watercolor, and keep it nice and loose and light here. Yeah, I definitely wouldn't advise drawing each and every one with pencil unless you keep it super light with your pencil. And this is where our white gouache with a little bit of purple gouache is going to come in so handy next week, because we're going to be able to get that opacity to happen. The opaque nature of gouache is going to allow us to really emphasize the highlights on these corona filaments. Really just doing a little bit in every corner, and that's mainly just so that I kind of know the parameters of how far out these are going all the way around. So that way I can keep it really light with my watercolor as I'm passing over these areas. Just make a mental note that, oh yeah, that's where all of our corona filament is going to be filled in at the end with that white gouache, with some lavender gouache that we're going to make with purple, some violet, and some white. Right. Okay, so I think we are ready to add, well, actually, let's sketch in a little bit of these leaves. I zoomed in a little farther than I did in the other one, so I don't have a lot of space for leaves. I definitely left more space for leaves next time, or last time. So let me just get a few leaves in here, and some of the stalks where the leaves are coming out. And if we had more time, I would sit here and sketch all the 3 dimensions of all of these leaves as well, but I gave you all the link to that fall leaves class if you want to have, the details of a leaf broken down like that. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be exactly like the photograph, but if you just want to put a few leaves coming in the corners, just so that it's not, so that it's got some kind of a background. We're going to keep the background really loose with our watercolor as well. Okay, so we're ready to get some of our first layers of watercolor on here. Lovely. Water cups. So I'm just going to mix my colors in the lid of my watercolor palette here. Next week I might have some backup palettes going as well. We'll see. And I'm surprised I didn't mention this until now, but last week we did have a class on basic watercolor techniques or watercolor basics, and I just accidentally dragged my pencil across across the center of this page with all these examples. So we practiced all these different ways of creating a wash and different textures and effects that you might do. And yeah, we are going to use a little bit of that iridescent watercolor, but I'm going to save it for next week. I'm going to keep it super basic tonight, just for these last 20 minutes after all this drawing. And next week, we'll really get into the painting and mixed media aspect of this piece. Okay, so the wet on wet wash can be really helpful for this. Also, if you happen to draw your lines super dark, which I know a lot of you possibly did, take your eraser before you go back in with watercolor. Just take your eraser and the side of the eraser and just go over the top layer of your pencil, just in case. I always do this before, like even today, I went to a portrait painting session and I drew the model and I was going to add some of my walnut ink. And before I started adding the ink, I took my eraser and just took the top layer of all the pencil off, because we don't need all that extra pencil, and we're just going to try to erase anything that's showing through at the end. You might as well just get rid of it, because all you need is just your bones of your drawing there. Okay, and then first let's so we're starting from the background and working our way forward. So that would mean filling in, although we're going to start in the center of the flower. We'll worry about this brown background next time, but think about the flower itself. What's on the bottom, we're going to work our way from the bottom up. So we're looking at that really light purple that's got a little bit of gray in it. So some purple and some gray, and we're going to make 2 or 3 different purples here. And we're going to exaggerate the colors a little bit, because why not? Because it's fun. And there's all this red, violet, or pink in the center, or there's a little bit. And I didn't add that until towards the end of creating this mixed media piece last time. I was like, I just feel like it's missing something. And then I added a bunch of pink and violet, and I just loved how it came to life. So we're going to add that at the beginning this time. So let's first just create some little puddles of water in our palette areas. I'm just dripping water from my paintbrush and my water cup onto my lid of my watercolor palette here. And then I'm going to take my rosiest red, and that's going to be my pink. I'm just going to water that down. And then I'll make a really pale purple. Oops. I was afraid of that. I might have to keep this a little off screen. Well, it's still on screen a little bit. Okay. Don't want to spill too much. You know what? It's still doing it. I'm going to use a palette. I have only had this new drafting table for about 4 months, and it still just keeps surprising me how it seems like I can control it better when I'm painting on my own. And then when I'm teaching on Zoom, I just keep forgetting about this. I'm going to use some little palettes to create my washes just because my table's on a slant and it's making my washes fall around. Okay, so I'm just taking eyedropper now. I mean, you can do it just like I did it before. I'm just doing it a little different because of my slanted table issue. We're making 3 different washes here. The rose. And then the red violet, and then the violet. So a little bit of that rose red again. And then I'll go ahead and put my violet over here, just so that I don't overtake the rose too quickly with the violet. Because we want it to be a red violet like that. We're not going to do the darker purple yet. Just going to keep this really pale light purple. And you could even add a little bit of white to your purple if you have white in the set like I do. And just really make it kind of milky and pale. And I really watered it down. I want it to be really pale purple. All right. I'm just going to bounce around to these petals and start to fill in nice and loose, keeping in mind those contours. And I really watered this down, and I am jumping around and leaving some areas blank because remember we have all of those corona filaments that are going to fill in here. So there might be a lot of blank spots. You can grab your paper towel as you go and maybe pull some of this out. We can do multiple layers of this. Okay. And we'll go ahead and take some of that red violet and come in here and just touch it while it's still a little wet and let it bleed into it a little bit. Again, you can grab it out with a paper towel if it's puddling up a little too much or anything like that. And I'm going to take the rose and go ahead and go in the center here. And I'm using a pretty large round brush. I might switch to a smaller round brush for this part. So depending on how big you painted your, or how big you drew your flower. So this is really watered down, but I'm still just kind of drawing with it and bouncing around and filling in the center where I see all that pink. And I accidentally just went over one of those stemma. Okay, so yeah, it seems like not that much when you just put it where the stemma's not. All right. Let's see. I'm just looking at the time and thinking about what we have time for and what to do next. So you ideally want to wait for each layer to dry. Like right now, I wouldn't want to do the stemma or anything, that green in the center, because it's going to bleed into all of this that is wet. So we want to let that dry first before we do much else. But we can go ahead and paint some of these leaves and some of this background, but we just want to be careful to leave a little gap. So I'm going to carefully paint a little in a way that leaves a gap between the petals and the background. And I'll show you what I mean as I'm going. Okay, so I'm gonna make a little wash of brown. I said we weren't going to get to the brown, but I forgot how we need to wait for the center to dry before we do anything else there. So I'm just using a couple of different browns from my set here, the dark brown and the light brown, and putting those together to create a nice little wash of brown. And I'm just gonna start to build that in the background, but see, I'm leaving a little gap between the petals and the background, and then maybe even a little gap between the leaves too, if we end up filling in some of the leaves here tonight. But I think this will probably be the last thing we do. And the reason to go so light with your first wash like this is because you can always do another wash when this layer dries. You can always go darker, but once you, you know, go super dark, it may be hard to take it back. Like trimming your bangs or your beard, you can always trim a little bit more. But if you trim it all off, like a hairdresser told me recently, the only thing she couldn't do was put it back. You can never put it back to the blank paper again, so you might as well start as light as possible and then just slowly build those darker values up. Okay, so I'm just trying to stay away from stuff that's wet so that it doesn't bleed into my background here, and also being mindful of where, you know, it needs to stay light for those corona filaments to be so light. Since we're not going to draw each and every one of them. But we do want it to be kind of dark around some of them. So we will build it up in our subsequent layers next week. Okay, let's see, what else can we do here while this is still fairly wet. We could go ahead in with a darker purple and let that bleed a little bit while it's still wet. So I'm just going to take this darker purple and add it to that lighter violet that I already had. And just start to draw in some of the corona filaments. This is why I was saying you don't necessarily have to draw everything with the pencil, because we're going to end up adding it with our paint. Because this is the darkest area of the painting, right? So we can go ahead and get pretty dark. But it's still pretty watered down and washy too. It just looks dark when I first put it on. It's going to dry and look a little lighter than this. And I can even dab it with my paper towel so that it's not so severe. And then I could even add some of my red violet in there too, because remember I decided at the end to add all that red violet, so why not go ahead and add some now. The hardest part is that I erased my lines so much that now I'm like accidentally painting over those stemma a little bit. Okay, if we had a little bit more time, I would go ahead and start to add some of that green to our ovaries and stemma, but I'm not going to. I'm going to save it for next week. So next week, the first thing we're going to do is use some illustration pens to pop out some of these details, make them pop, and then we'll keep going in with all these different layers of colors and building up our purple passion flower. Before we go, does anybody want to hold up their drawings or their beginning of their painting so far, and we can spotlight you and see how you're doing? Here's Sarah. Oh, that's lovely, Sarah. Gorgeous. Really nice work. All right. And this is Graciela. Oh, I love the effect your blinds are making on that. Really nice light washes so far. That's really nice. Nicole Hawkins. Oh, that's lovely. Really nice light value there with those washes. Looking like a great start. Okay, and this is Autumn. Beautiful, Autumn. Oh yeah, look at your sketch too. Really nice. Thank you for sharing. And this is Shannon. Oh, look at that detail on those corona filaments. I love it. Okay. And this is Laura. Hold it up a little higher, Laura. Oh yeah, that's looking really whimsical so far. Okay. And this is Brittany. Ooh, nice close up. Yeah, very nice detail. Well, we're experts on these flowers now. Okay, did I miss anyone that's holding theirs up? Let me see. I don't think so. Okay. Replace my spotlight. All right, well, we have 4 minutes left. Does anybody have any questions? Were there any questions in the chat that I could go back and answer?
No, I think you got all of them. You did a great job.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you all so much, and I will see you next week, and we will continue on with the mixed media purple passion flower. You'll have a great night, and thank you. Thank you so much. Good night.